This is my true story. I spent my whole life working for my family, giving them every chance to succeed, and I thought they would stay close to me in my old age. But I was wrong. For 20 years, they never came to see me, never called, never asked how I was. Holidays passed in silence, birthdays forgotten, and I sat alone in a house I built for them. They thought I was powerless, just an old man waiting to die. But what they didn't know was that I had one last surprise waiting for them in my safe. Before I tell you what happened, comment where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I gave everything I had to my children, because in my mind, that was what a father was supposed to do. From the moment they were born, I worked without rest. My life was not filled with luxuries or comforts, but with long hours, tired hands, and sore bones. I took jobs that others avoided, dirty work, heavy work, dangerous work, because those jobs paid a little more, and every extra dollar meant food on their plates, clothes on their backs, and futures that looked brighter than mine ever had. I remember the mornings when I would leave before the sun came up, stepping out quietly so I didn't wake them. I remember the nights when I came home late, my clothes covered in dust and sweat, but I still forced a smile when I saw them because I wanted them to feel safe and cared for. Their mother and I often went without new clothes or new shoes, patching up the old ones instead, but the children never noticed because we made sure they always had something better. That was our choice, and I never regretted it. When they grew older, the expenses grew heavier. School fees, books, uniforms, it all piled up, but I found a way. If I had to take a second shift, I did it. If I had to borrow for a short time, I swallowed my pride and signed the papers. When they reached high school, I wanted them to have more than just the basics. I wanted them to stand equal with the richer kids, so I saved until I could buy them their first cars. They weren't the fanciest, but they ran well, and I can still remember the way my children smiled when I handed them the keys. That smile made the sleepless nights worth it. Later, when they wanted to go to college, I paid for their education, every semester, every book, every fee. I told myself that education would open doors for them, doors that had always been shut to me. And when they stepped into those doors, I felt proud, as if I had entered them myself. When they got married, I gave again. I helped with weddings, paid deposits, gave down payments for houses. I watched them move into homes bigger than mine, with better furniture, with new appliances, and I felt joy because I believed I had succeeded as a father. I thought those investments in their lives would tie us together. I thought those sacrifices would grow into loyalty, that they would look back and remember the man who gave them everything. In my heart, I dreamed of old age filled with visits, filled with laughter, filled with family dinners where my children came back home, bringing their kids, filling my house with the noise of love. I imagined holidays where they would sit beside me, thanking me for everything I had done, telling stories from their childhood, letting me feel important, not forgotten. I never asked for riches for myself. I never wanted expensive cars, fancy vacations, or big houses. My greatest dream was small, but powerful. I wanted my children to visit me, to sit with me, to care for me when I grew weak. I wanted to be surrounded by family, the very family I had built with my own sacrifices. That was the reward I thought I had earned. Every time I looked at them, I believed that reward would come. Every time I gave them something, I thought to myself, this will keep us close. Every time I paid a bill or signed a paper, I thought, this will remind them of my love. But I was wrong. The silence began slowly, so slowly that at first I did not notice it. After retirement, when I finally stepped away from the years of labor that had drained my body, I thought life would finally be different. I thought my children would visit more often because I would be home and waiting. I thought they would call to check on me because they would know I had nothing else but time. In the first year, they came every so often. A birthday, a holiday, maybe a Sunday lunch. They would bring their kids, sit at the table for a few hours, and then rush away because they were busy. I told myself it was normal. They had their own lives. They had work, families, responsibilities. I tried not to feel hurt when the visits were short. I told myself that as long as they came sometimes, I should be grateful. But then the visits started to grow fewer. A year passed, and they skipped my birthday, sending only a quick message. Holidays that used to be filled with voices turned into quiet nights with the television playing in the background while I sat alone. The phone that once rang often became quiet. I would sit in my chair and stare at it, waiting for it to light up. Sometimes I picked it up to make sure it was working. I called myself to hear the tone, just to make sure nothing was wrong. But the truth was, the phone was fine, they simply weren't calling. I tried calling them instead, but many times the calls went unanswered. Sometimes I left messages, telling them I missed them, asking them to visit. Most of the time, there was no reply. When they did answer, the words were short, rushed, empty. "Sorry, Dad, we're busy. We'll come next week." But next week never came. I told myself to be patient, that life is busy, that children eventually grow apart, but deep inside I felt the ache of being forgotten. I began to notice the pattern. Birthdays passed with no cake, no hugs, no family sitting around the table. My children no longer asked if I was eating well, if I needed medicine, if I was lonely. They acted as if I had disappeared. 1 year became 5, 5 became 10, then came 20. 20 long years without a single visit. 20 years where no footsteps of family echoed in my home. The chairs at the dining table collected dust. The photos on the wall stared back at me like ghosts of a family that no longer existed. The silence was not just the absence of voices. It was betrayal. It was the children I had sacrificed everything for deciding that I no longer mattered. I tried to stay strong, but each year the silence grew heavier. It was as if they had erased me from their world, leaving me to sit in the shadows of a life I had built for them. Loneliness became my only companion. At first I tried to ignore it. I told myself that they were just busy, that one day the door would open again and I would see their faces. I kept the dining table ready on holidays, placing extra plates as if they might walk in at any moment. I cooked more food than I could eat, hoping maybe they would surprise me. But the food went cold, the plates stayed untouched, and I sat there alone, listening to the clock tick louder than any voice. Year after year, I spent Christmases staring at the empty space across the table where my children should have been. Birthdays became just another day, with no laughter, no cards, no hugs. I blew out candles by myself, whispering wishes into the darkness, wishes that never came true. Neighbors noticed. They would sometimes knock on my door, bringing me a plate of food or inviting me to join them. Strangers showed me more kindness than the family I had given everything to. They asked how I was feeling, if I needed medicine, if I wanted company. And while I was grateful, it hurt deeply to know that the people who should have cared didn't. The ones who owed me nothing gave me warmth, while the ones who owed me their whole lives gave me silence. I began to dread weekends because that was when families came together, and I had no one. I dreaded evenings because the silence in the house grew heavier after the sun went down. Nights were the worst. I would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling, asking myself why. Why had they abandoned me? What had I done to deserve being erased? There were nights I cried quietly, not out of weakness, but out of despair. My tears soaked the pillow as I remembered the past. Birthdays when I worked extra shifts just to buy them gifts. Holidays when I sacrificed my own comfort to give them joy. Times when I held them while they cried as children and promised them I would always be there. But when the time came for them to stand by me, they vanished. The loneliness grew so heavy that it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. Every sound in the house reminded me of the emptiness. The ticking clock, the wind against the window, the creak of the floorboards. All of it was a reminder that I was alone. I walked through my house like a ghost, moving from room to room, filled with memories of a family that no longer cared. I saw their childhood bedrooms, now empty and dusty. I touched the walls that once echoed with laughter. I opened photo albums and stared at smiling faces that no longer looked back at me in real life. Loneliness was no longer just a feeling. It became my existence. And the cruelest part of it all was that it was not strangers who abandoned me, but my own blood. In the corner of my study sat an old metal safe. Most people who came into my house hardly noticed it. It was dusty, plain, and locked tight. My children never asked about it, because they never cared to look beyond their own wants. But that safe had been with me for decades. Inside it, I kept more than just money. I kept my life's work. I kept the deeds to properties I had worked myself to the bone to buy. I kept bank records, bonds, and investments. I kept papers with numbers that proved I was not just an old man living in a quiet house, but a man who had built something of real value. That safe carried my legacy. It carried the story of every sacrifice, every hour of labor, every night of hunger I endured so that my children could eat better. But inside the safe, I kept something else too, things they would not expect. Letters I had written over the years, explaining how their silence had broken me. Notes I wrote late at night after holidays passed with no visits. Words filled with pain but also with truth. A record of what 20 years of abandonment does to a father. I tucked those letters away, sealing them in envelopes, placing them alongside the documents. That safe was more than steel and numbers. It was my memory, my judgment, my last weapon. My children had no idea what it held because they never cared to ask. They assumed I had nothing left. They assumed I was just an old man sitting alone in a chair, powerless, waiting for the end. They never realized that the safe was my shield and my sword. For years, I did not open it except to add another document or another note. For years, I left it locked while the dust grew on its surface. But deep down, I always knew it would matter one day. Because while my children had erased me, I had not erased them. I knew their greed. I knew that one day when I was gone they would return. Not for me, not for love, but for what they thought was inside. They would come to the safe like vultures circling a carcass, believing they would finally profit from the man they ignored for decades. And that thought gave me a kind of strength. Every time I walked past the safe, I reminded myself, they may have abandoned me, but I am not powerless. I may sit alone, but my silence is not weakness. That safe was my final card to play, and when the time came, it would speak louder than any words I could say in life. The decision came to me slowly, after years of waiting, years of silence, and years of loneliness that carved me hollow. At first, I told myself to be patient, that maybe one day my children would remember me and come back. I thought perhaps a birthday would stir their hearts, or maybe the holidays would remind them of what family once meant. But every year that passed proved me wrong. 20 years of abandonment was all the proof I needed. They had made their choice, and their choice was to erase me from their lives. That was when I realized I had to make my choice too. My decision was simple. If they would not honor me in life, they would not profit from me in death. I would not let them gather around my coffin pretending to cry, pretending to care, waiting only to see what I left behind. If they thought my silence was weakness, then they would learn that my silence was planning. I went to my desk and pulled out the papers I had been gathering for years. Property deeds, bank accounts, bonds, insurance policies, everything that carried my name. I read through them carefully, my eyes sharper than ever even as my body grew weak. And then I rewrote my will. Page after page, I removed their names completely. No son, no daughter, no share. Their absence in my life would now be reflected in their absence from my inheritance. I directed everything toward those who had shown me kindness when my own children had abandoned me. The neighbors who knocked on my door with food when no one else cared. The charities that helped people like me when I was younger and struggling. The people who proved that compassion did not always come from blood. But I knew I needed to leave one last thing behind for my children. Not money, not houses, not riches. I needed to leave them truth. I wrote a letter, sharp and final, and I placed it inside the safe with the documents. In the letter, I told them everything I had felt over those 20 years. I told them about the nights I sat alone on holidays, waiting for a door that never opened. I told them about the pain of unanswered phone calls, about the tears I shed when I realized strangers cared for me more than they did. I told them how their absence had cut me deeper than any hardship I had endured in life. And finally, I told them why they would get nothing from me. You ignored me in life. You will not profit from my death. Those were the words I underlined, words that would echo long after I was gone. I placed the letter in the safe, locked it, and tucked the key away where it would only be found after my passing. That safe became more than storage. It became my revenge, my justice, my voice from beyond the grave. I had made my decision. My children had chosen to abandon me, and I had chosen to erase them in return. When the day came that they finally returned to my house, it would not be out of love, but out of greed. And when they opened that safe, their hands shaking with expectation, they would finally understand the cost of 20 years of silence. When the time finally came for the safe to be opened, the truth of what I had left inside was revealed. I had thought long and hard about what to place in there, and every choice was deliberate. At the front were the property deeds, each one showing the houses and land I had worked years to buy. Behind them were the bank statements, clear proof of accounts that held more than they ever imagined. $3.7 million in assets gathered from decades of sacrifice, savings, and careful planning. There were insurance policies, bonds, and documents that tied every part of my life together. On paper, it looked like the fortune of a man who had lived for his family, who had built everything for them. But then came the part they did not expect. Alongside those riches, I had placed letters, not one, but many. Letters written over 20 years of abandonment. Each letter described a holiday I had spent alone, a birthday they had forgotten, a night when my house echoed with silence instead of laughter. I had written in simple words, no decoration, no softness, just truth. I told them how I sat by the window waiting for them, how I cooked too much food hoping they might come, how I cried quietly in my room when I realized they never would. In those letters, I explained my decision clearly. I told them that while the safe held proof of wealth, none of it was theirs. I had transferred it all, every dollar, every property, every asset, to people who had shown me kindness, the neighbors who checked on me when they never did, the charities that gave warmth to strangers when my own blood gave me coldness, the organizations that helped people in need because I wanted my legacy to touch those who deserved it. The safe contained copies of the legal transfers, signed and sealed, so they would know it was final and untouchable. But the most powerful thing in that safe was not the deeds or the numbers. It was the final letter. A single envelope with their names written across the front. Inside it read, "For 20 years, you abandoned me. You left me alone while you lived your lives. You let strangers care for me while you turned your backs. Now, you have come not for me, but for what I built. But you will get nothing. My wealth is gone to those who showed me love. All you inherit from me is the truth, that you chose absence, and now absence is your reward." Every page in that safe carried proof that I had never been powerless. They thought I had been sitting in this house as a forgotten old man with nothing left to give. But the truth was that I had been holding the final word all along. My safe was not just a container of money, it was a container of justice. When they opened it, they would not only see what they had lost, but also why they had lost it. And that truth would weigh heavier on their shoulders than the fortune itself. The aftermath began the moment the news of my passing reached them. For 20 years they had no time to visit me, no time to call, no time to care. But suddenly they had time to rush to my house. They came not in sorrow, not in grief, but in urgency. They came with greedy hearts, whispering to each other about what might be inside the safe I had guarded all those years. My neighbors told me later they had never seen my house so full. Cars lined the street. Relatives who hadn't set foot in my home for decades suddenly walked in as if they belonged there. They did not gather around my chair where I once sat alone. They did not sit at the dining table where the plates had been empty every holiday. They went straight for the study, straight for the safe. For the first time in 20 years, my family was united, not in love, but in greed. They circled the safe with excitement. Some of them smiled, some whispered, and some even laughed, as if my death was nothing more than their ticket to comfort. They expected money, property, and luxury. They expected a reward after 2 decades of absence. They did not talk about my loneliness. They did not ask what I felt all those years. They did not regret the silence. Their eyes were on the lock. When it finally clicked open, their hands shook not from sadness, but from hunger. They pulled out the documents quickly, spreading them across the desk. They gasped at the property deeds. Their eyes widened at the bank statements. They whispered to each other about the numbers. In that moment, they thought they had won. They thought they had secured their future from the man they had forgotten. But then they reached the letters. They opened the envelopes with less excitement, confusion spreading across their faces as they read the words. Slowly, the joy drained from the room. The more they read, the heavier the silence became. My words cut through their greed like a blade. They read about the 20 Christmases I spent alone. They read about the birthdays without calls. They read about the dinners where I sat by myself. Every sentence reminded them of the years they chose to erase me. Then came the final blow. They found the legal transfers. Every property deed, every bank account, every bond, gone from their reach, already moved into the hands of neighbors, charities, and organizations that had shown kindness. Their voices rose in anger, shouting, accusing, but the truth was clear. It was too late. They had come too late. For the first time in 20 years, they all stood together, not as heirs of wealth, but as heirs of regret. The aftermath of my passing was not what they expected. They thought they would walk away richer. Instead, they walked away empty, holding only the weight of shame. For me, that was justice. For them, that was punishment. The letter was the heart of everything I left behind. It was the peace they could not argue with, the truth they could not erase, the voice they could not silence. I had written it carefully, word by word, in my own hand, because I wanted them to hear me even when I was gone. When they opened the envelope and saw their names written on it, I knew they would expect kind words or forgiveness. But what they found was something sharper, something final. The letter began with the truth they had tried to avoid. You ignored me in life. You will not profit from my death. Those were the first lines, written in bold, and I can imagine the sting as they read them. They wanted money, but instead they got my voice, stronger than ever. In the letter, I told them about the 20 years of silence. I described the empty Christmas dinners where I cooked too much food, hoping they might show up, only to throw most of it away. I wrote about the birthdays where I sat alone, lighting a candle for myself, whispering a wish into the darkness that they would call, only to blow it out in silence. I told them about the nights I sat by the window, staring out at the street, hoping to see their car pull up, but it never did. I reminded them of the calls they ignored, the messages unanswered, the promises broken. I told them how each year my hope grew smaller until it disappeared completely. But I didn't just write about my pain. I wrote about my decision. I explained that while the safe had once held their future, it no longer did. Every asset had been transferred legally. Every account moved. Every deed reassigned. I told them who I left it to. The neighbors who brought me food when they would not. The charities that gave blankets to strangers while they left me cold. The organizations that reminded me of compassion when my own family showed me none. I wrote that these people had become more of a family to me than my own blood, because family is not just about being born into the same line. It is about showing love, loyalty, and respect. I also wrote about power. They thought I had none, sitting alone in a chair, waiting for death. But the safe proved otherwise. I told them, I was never powerless. You just stopped looking. You thought my silence was weakness, but it was strength. I was building the end while you were busy forgetting me. Every word in that letter was like a mirror, forcing them to see themselves for who they really were. They wanted to inherit riches, but instead they inherited truth. At the end of the letter, I gave them one last message. You had 20 years to be my children. You chose not to be. Now you have nothing. The world will not remember you as heirs of wealth, but as children who abandoned their father. That is the legacy you gave yourselves. I sealed the letter knowing those words would cut deeper than any loss of money. Because money can be replaced, but dignity cannot. They had stolen mine, and now I had taken theirs. When they finished reading, the room must have been silent. No shouting, no excuses, just the sound of shame sinking into their hearts. The letter was not long, but it was enough. Enough to remind them that the man they ignored for 20 years had the final word. The shock hit them harder than they ever expected. For 20 years, they had lived without me, never visiting, never calling, acting as if I no longer existed. Yet in their minds, they believed one thing was certain, that when I was gone, everything I had built would fall into their hands. They had told themselves a story, that my silence meant I was weak, that my loneliness meant I was waiting for them, that my safe was their future. But when the truth came out, when they opened that safe and read the words I left, the ground beneath them collapsed. At first, there was denial. They argued with each other, accusing one another of lies, as if the papers inside were some kind of trick. They searched through every page, desperate to find their names, desperate to find even a small piece that belonged to them. But there was nothing. Page after page confirmed the same reality. They had been erased. The greed that had brought them together quickly turned into rage. Some shouted, demanding answers I could no longer give. Others cried, realizing too late what their absence had cost them. But the shock was not just about the money, or the houses, or the accounts. The deeper shock was realizing that I had seen through them the entire time. They thought they fooled me, thought I was blind to their neglect, thought I was too weak to act. But the safe showed them I had been watching, waiting, preparing. They realized my silence had not been weakness, it had been judgment. The shame spread quickly. Neighbors who had shown me kindness now watched as my children, who had abandoned me, left my home with nothing. People in the community whispered about it, and the whispers grew into stories. My children became known not as heirs, but as the ungrateful ones, the ones who had left their father alone and paid the price. That was part of the shock, too. It wasn't just about what they lost, but about what they could never regain, their image, their pride, their dignity. For me, the shock I wanted them to feel was not just financial, but emotional. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be blindsided, to expect love and receive nothing, to expect comfort and face emptiness. It was the same feeling I had carried for 20 years every time I set an extra plate at the table and stared at the empty chair. That was my justice, giving them the same hollow silence they had given me. They left my house that day in anger, in shame, in disbelief. Some tried to comfort themselves by saying the money was never real, but they knew it was. Some tried to blame each other, but deep down, they knew the blame was theirs. The shock stayed with them because it was not just about what they found in the safe, it was about what they didn't. No love, no forgiveness, no inheritance, only the truth. Justice for me was never about money. Justice was about truth. For 20 long years, I sat in silence, abandoned by the very family I gave my life to. I ate meals alone. I spent holidays in the quiet. I lived with the echo of a house that was once full of laughter. They thought I would die quietly and leave them everything, as if my life meant nothing more than the wealth I created. But what they didn't understand was that I had one last choice, and I made it carefully. When they opened that safe, they expected comfort. What they found instead was judgment. My money, my properties, my accounts, all of it had already been transferred to people who had shown kindness. The neighbors who brought me food, the charities that clothed strangers, the organizations that gave hope to the poor. These were the people who inherited my work. My family, the ones who erased me, inherited nothing but their own shame. That was my justice. I knew they would be angry, but I also knew anger was weaker than shame. Anger fades, but shame lingers. They could not undo 20 years of silence. They could not erase the words I left in my letter. The world now saw them for who they were, Not loyal children, but selfish ones. Their names were not written on my will, and their faces were not remembered with honor. My legacy did not pass through them. It passed through those who cared, those who visited, those who gave me dignity when they would not. And that truth will outlive them. For me, justice came in peace. I left this world knowing I had the final word. They could not rewrite my story. They could not twist the truth. My voice was locked in that safe, and when they finally listened, it was too late to change anything. The same way it was too late for them to change the last 20 years. They will remember me not for what I gave them, but for what I took away. And every time they think about the wealth they lost, they will also remember the father they abandoned. That is the weight they will carry for the rest of their lives. Final thought. They refused to visit me for 20 years. Now they will live with the memory of what I left behind and what I took away.